The Man in the Iron Mask, by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 46. The Son of Biscarat. The Bretons of the Isle were very proud of this victory. Aramis did not encourage them in the feeling. "What will happen," said he to Porthos, when everybody was gone home, "will be that the anger of the king will be roused by the account of the resistance, and that these brave people will be decimated or shot when they are taken, which cannot fail to take place." "From which it results, then," said Porthos, "that what we have done is of not the slightest use." "For the moment it may be," replied the bishop, "for we have a prisoner from whom we shall learn what our enemies are preparing to do." "Yes, let us interrogate the prisoner," said Porthos, "and the means of making him speak are very simple. We are going to supper. We will invite him to join us. As he drinks, he will talk." This was done. The officer was at first rather uneasy, but became reassured on seeing what sort of men he had to deal with. He gave, without having any fear of compromising himself, all the details imaginable of the resignation and departure of D'Artagnan. He explained how, after that departure, the new leader of the expedition had ordered a surprise upon Belle Isle. There his explanation stopped. Aramis and Porthos exchanged a glance that evinced their despair. No more dependence to be placed now on D'Artagnan's fertile imagination. No further resource in the event of defeat. Aramis, continuing his interrogations, asked the prisoner what the leaders of the expedition contemplated doing with the leaders of Belle Isle. "The orders are," replied he, "to kill during combat, or hang afterwards." Porthos and Aramis looked at each other again, and the color mounted to their faces. "I am too light for the gallows," replied Aramis. "People like me are not hung." "And I am too heavy," said Porthos. "People like me break the cord." "I am sure," said the prisoner, gallantly, "that we could have guaranteed you the exact kind of death you preferred." "A thousand thanks," said Aramis, seriously. Porthos bowed. "One more cup of wine to your health," said he, drinking himself. From one subject to another the chat with the officer was prolonged. He was an intelligent gentleman, and suffered himself to be led on by the charm of Aramis's wit and Porthos's cordial bonhomie. "Pardon me," said he, "if I address a question to you, but men who are in their sixth bottle have a clear right to forget themselves a little." "Address it!" cried Porthos. "Address it!" "Speak," said Aramis. "Were you not, gentlemen, both in the musketeers of the late king?" "Yes, monsieur, and amongst the best of them, if you please," said Porthos. "That is true. I should say even the best of all soldiers, messieurs, if I did not fear to offend the memory of my father." "Of your father?" cried Aramis. "Do you know what my name is?" "Ma foi! No, monsieur, but you can tell us, and—" "I am called Georges de Biscarat." "Oh!" cried Porthos, in his turn. "Biscarat! Do you remember that name, Aramis?" "Biscarat," reflected the bishop. "It seems to me—" "Try to recollect, monsieur," said the officer. "Pardieu, that won't take me long," said Porthos. "Biscarat, called Cardinal, one of the four who interrupted us on the day on which we formed our friendship with D'Artagnan, sword in hand." "Precisely, gentlemen." "The only one," cried Aramis, eagerly, "we could not scratch." "Consequently, a capital blade," said the prisoner. "That's true, most true!" exclaimed both friends together. "Ma foi! Monsieur Biscarat, we are delighted to make the acquaintance of such a brave man's son." Biscarat pressed the hands held out by the two musketeers. Aramis looked at Porthos as much as to say, "Here is a man who will help us." And without delay, "Confess, monsieur," said he, "that it is good to have once been a good man." "My father always said so, monsieur." Confess likewise that it is a sad circumstance in which you find yourself, of falling in with men destined to be shot or hung, and to learn that these men are old acquaintances, in fact, hereditary friends." "Oh, you are not reserved for such a frightful fate as that, messieurs and friends," said the young man, warmly. "Bah, you said so yourself." "I said so just now, when I did not know you, but now that I know you, I say, you will evade this dismal fate if you wish." "How, if we wish?" echoed Aramis, whose eyes beamed with intelligence as he looked alternately at the prisoner and Porthos. "Provided," continued Porthos, looking in his turn with noble intrepidity at M. Biscarrat and the bishop, "provided nothing disgraceful be required of us." "Nothing at all will be required of you, gentlemen," replied the officer. "What should they ask of you? If they find you, they will kill you; that is a predetermined thing. Try, then, gentlemen, to prevent their finding you." "I don't think I am mistaken," said Porthos, with dignity, "but it appears evident to me that if they want to find us, they must come and seek us here." "In that you are perfectly right, my worthy friend," replied Aramis, constantly consulting with his looks the countenance of Biscarrat, who had grown silent and constrained. "You wish, Monsieur de Biscarrat, to say something to us, to make us some overture, and you dare not. Is that true?" "Ah, gentlemen and friends, it is because by speaking I betray the watchword. But hark! I hear a voice that frees mine by dominating it." "Cannon!" said Porthos. "Cannon and musketry, too!" cried the bishop. On hearing at a distance, among the rocks, these sinister reports of a combat which they thought had ceased. "What can that be?" asked Porthos. "Eh, pardieu!" cried Aramis, "that is just what I expected." "What is that?" "That the attack made by you was nothing but a feint. Is that not true, monsieur? And whilst your companions allowed themselves to be repulsed, you were certain of effecting a landing on the other side of the island." "Oh, several, monsieur." "We are lost, then," said the bishop of Vannes, quietly. "Lost! That is possible," replied the Seigneur de Pierrefonds; "but we are not taken or hung." And so saying, he rose from the table, went to the wall, and coolly took down his sword and pistols, which he examined with the care of an old soldier who is preparing for battle, and who feels that life, in a great measure, depends upon the excellence and right conditions of his arms. At the report of the cannon, at the news of the surprise which might deliver up the island to the royal troops, the terrified crowd rushed precipitately to the fort to demand assistance and advice from their leaders. Aramis, pale and downcast, between two flambeaux, showed himself at the window which looked into the principal court, full of soldiers waiting for orders, and bewildered inhabitants imploring succor. "My friends," said D'Herblay, in a grave and sonorous voice, "Monsieur Fouquet, your protector, your friend, your father, has been arrested by an order of the king and thrown into the Bastille." A sustained yell of vengeful fury came floating up to the window at which the bishop stood, and enveloped him in a magnetic field. "Avenge Monsieur Fouquet!" cried the most excited of his hearers. "Death to the royalists!" "No, my friends," replied Aramis, solemnly. "No, my friends, no resistance. The king is master in his kingdom. The king is the mandatory of God. The king and God have struck Monsieur Fouquet. Humble yourselves before the hand of God. Love God and the king, who have struck Monsieur Fouquet. But do not avenge your seigneur. Do not think of avenging him. You would sacrifice yourselves in vain, you, your wives and children, your property, your liberty. Lay down your arms, my friends, lay down your arms, since the king commands you so to do, and retire peaceably to your dwellings. It is I who ask you to do so. It is I who beg you to do so. It is I who now, in the hour of need, command you to do so, in the name of M. Fouquet." The crowd collected under the window uttered a prolonged roar of anger and terror. "The soldiers of Louis XIV. Have reached the island," continued Aramis. "From this time it would no longer be a fight betwixt them and you, it would be a massacre. Begone, then, begone and forget. This time I command you, in the name of the Lord of hosts." The mutineers retired slowly, submissive, silent. "Ah! What have you just been saying, my friend?" said Porthos. "Monsieur," said Biscarrat to the bishop, "you may save all these inhabitants, but thus you will neither save yourself nor your friend." "Monsieur de Biscarrat," said the bishop of Vannes, with a singular accent of nobility and courtesy, "Monsieur de Biscarrat, be kind enough to resume your liberty." "I am very willing to do so, monsieur, but " "That would render us a service, for when announcing to the king's lieutenant the submission of the islanders, you will perhaps obtain some grace for us on informing him of the manner in which that submission has been effected." "Grace!" replied Porthos with flashing eyes. "What is the meaning of that word?" Aramis touched the elbow of his friend roughly, as he had been accustomed to do in the days of their youth, when he wanted to warn Porthos that he had committed, or was about to commit, a blunder. Porthos understood him, and was silent immediately. "I will go, messieurs," replied Biscarrat, a little surprised likewise at the word grace pronounced by the haughty musketeer, of and to whom, but a few minutes before, he had related with so much enthusiasm the heroic exploits with which his father had delighted him. "Go, then, Monsieur Biscarrat," said Aramis, bowing to him, "and at parting receive the expression of our entire gratitude." "But you, monsieur, you whom I think it is an honor to call my friends, since you have been willing to accept that title, what will become of you in the meantime?" replied the officer, very much agitated at taking leave of the two ancient adversaries of his father. "We will wait here." "But, mon Dieu, the order is precise and formal." "I am Bishop of Vannes, Monsieur de Biscarrat, and they no more shoot a bishop than they hang a gentleman." "Ah, yes, monsieur, yes, monseigneur," replied Biscarrat. "It is true, you are right. There is still that chance for you. Then I will depart. I will repair to the commander of the expedition, the king's lieutenant. Adieu, then, messieurs, or rather, to meet again, I hope." The worthy officer, jumping upon a horse given him by Aramis, departed in the direction of the sound of cannon, which, by surging the crowd into the fort, had interrupted the conversation of the two friends with their prisoner. Aramis watched the departure, and when left alone with Porthos, "Well, do you comprehend?" said he. "Ma foi, no!" "Did not Biscarrat inconvenience you here?" "No, he is a brave fellow." "Yes, but the grotto of Locmaria, is it necessary all the world should know it?" "Ah, that is true, that is true, I comprehend. We are going to escape by the cavern." "If you please," cried Aramis, gayly. "Forward, friend Porthos, our boat awaits us. King Louis has not caught us yet." Chapter 47. The Grotto of Locmaria. The cavern of Locmaria was sufficiently distant from the mole to render it necessary for our friends to husband their strength in order to reach it. Besides, night was advancing; midnight had struck at the fort. Porthos and Aramis were loaded with money and arms. They walked, then, across the heath, which stretched between the mole and the cavern, listening to every noise, in order better to avoid an ambush. From time to time, on the road which they had carefully left on their left, passed fugitives coming from the interior, at the news of the landing of the royal troops. Aramis and Porthos, concealed behind some projecting mass of rock, collected the words that escaped from the poor people, who fled trembling, carrying with them their most valuable effects, and tried, whilst listening to their complaints, to gather something from them for their own interest. At length, after a rapid race, frequently interrupted by prudent stoppages, they reached the deep grottos, in which the prophetic Bishop of Vannes had taken care to have secreted a bark capable of keeping the sea at this fine season.
"My good friend," said Porthos, panting vigorously, "we have arrived, it seems. But I thought you spoke of 3 men, 3 servants, who were to accompany us. I don't see them. Where are they?"
"Why should you see them, Porthos?" replied Aramis. "They are certainly waiting for us in the cavern, and, no doubt, are resting, having accomplished their rough and difficult task." Aramis stopped Porthos, who was preparing to enter the cavern. "Will you allow me, my friend," said he to the giant, "to pass in first? I know the signal I have given to these men, who, not hearing it, would be very likely to fire upon you or slash away with their knives in the dark." "Go on, then, Aramis, go on. Go first. You impersonate wisdom and foresight. Go. Ah! There is that fatigue again, of which I spoke to you. It has just seized me afresh." Aramis left Porthos sitting at the entrance of the grotto, and bowing his head, he penetrated into the interior of the cavern, imitating the cry of the owl. A little plaintive cooing, a scarcely distinct echo, replied from the depths of the cave. Aramis pursued his way cautiously, and soon was stopped by the same kind of cry as he had first uttered, within 10 paces of him. "Are you there, Yves?" said the bishop.
"Yes, monseigneur. Goenne is here likewise. His son accompanies us."
"That is well. Are all things ready?"
"Yes, monseigneur."
"Go to the entrance of the grottos, my good Yves, and you will there find the Seigneur de Pierrefonds, who is resting after the fatigue of our journey. And if he should happen not to be able to walk, lift him up and bring him hither to me." The 3 men obeyed, but the recommendation given to his servants was superfluous. Porthos, refreshed, had already commenced the descent, and his heavy step resounded amongst the cavities, formed and supported by columns of porphyry and granite. As soon as the Seigneur de Bracieux had rejoined the bishop, the Bretons lighted a lantern with which they were furnished, and Porthos assured his friend that he felt as strong again as ever. "Let us inspect the boat," said Aramis, "and satisfy ourselves at once what it will hold."
"Do not go too near with the light," said the patron Yves, "for as you desired me, monseigneur, I have placed under the bench of the poop, in the coffer you know of, the barrel of powder, and the musket charges that you sent me from the fort."
"Very well," said Aramis, and taking the lantern himself, he examined minutely all parts of the canoe, with the precautions of a man who is neither timid nor ignorant in the face of danger. The canoe was long, light, drawing little water, thin of keel, in short, one of those that have always been so aptly built at Belle Isle, a little high in its sides, solid upon the water, very manageable, furnished with planks which, in uncertain weather, formed a sort of deck over which the waves might glide, so as to protect the rowers. In 2 well-closed coffers, placed beneath the benches of the prow and the poop, Aramis found bread, biscuit, dried fruits, a quarter of bacon, a good provision of water in leathern bottles, the whole forming rations sufficient for people who did not mean to quit the coast, and would be able to revictual if necessity commanded. The arms, 8 muskets, and as many horse pistols, were in good condition, and all loaded. There were additional oars, in case of accident, and that little sail called trinquet, which assists the speed of the canoe at the same time the boatmen row, and is so useful when the breeze is slack. When Aramis had seen to all these things, and appeared satisfied with the results of his inspection, "Let us consult Porthos," said he, "to know if we must endeavor to get the boat out by the unknown extremity of the grotto, following the descent and the shade of the cavern, or whether it be better, in the open air, to make it slide upon its rollers through the bushes, leveling the road of the little beach, which is but 20 feet high, and gives at high tide 3 or 4 fathoms of good water upon a sound bottom.
"It must be as you please, monseigneur," replied the skipper Yves, respectfully; "but I don't believe that by the slope of the cavern, and in the dark in which we shall be obliged to maneuver our boat, the road will be so convenient as the open air. I know the beach well, and can certify that it is as smooth as a grass plot in a garden. The interior of the grotto, on the contrary, is rough, without reckoning, monseigneur, that at its extremity we shall come to the trench which leads into the sea, and perhaps the canoe will not pass down it."
"I have made my calculation," said the bishop, "and I am certain it will pass."
"So be it. I wish it may, monseigneur," continued Yves; "but your highness knows very well that to make it reach the extremity of the trench, there is an enormous stone to be lifted, that under which the fox always passes, and which closes the trench like a door."
"It can be raised," said Porthos. "That is nothing."
"Oh, I know that monseigneur has the strength of 10 men," replied Yves, "but that is giving him a great deal of trouble."
"I think the skipper may be right," said Aramis. "Let us try the open air passage."
"The more so, monseigneur," continued the fisherman, "that we should not be able to embark before day. It will require so much labor, and that as soon as daylight appears, a good vedette placed outside the grotto would be necessary, indispensable even, to watch the maneuvers of the lighters or cruisers that are on the lookout for us."
"Yes, yes, Yves, your reasons are good. We will go by the beach." And the 3 robust Bretons went to the boat, and were beginning to place their rollers underneath it to put it in motion, when the distant barking of dogs was heard, proceeding from the interior of the island. Aramis darted out of the grotto, followed by Porthos. Dawn just tinted with purple and white the waves and plain; through the dim light, melancholy fir trees waved their tender branches over the pebbles, and long flights of crows were skimming with their black wings the shimmering fields of buckwheat. In a quarter of an hour it would be clear daylight; the wakened birds announced it to all nature. The barkings which had been heard, which had stopped the 3 fishermen engaged in moving the boat, and had brought Aramis and Porthos out of the cavern, now seemed to come from a deep gorge within about a league of the grotto. "It is a pack of hounds," said Porthos. "The dogs are on a scent." "Who can be hunting at such a moment as this?" said Aramis. "And this way particularly," continued Porthos, "where they might expect the army of the royalists." "The noise comes nearer. Yes, you are right, Porthos, the dogs are on a scent. But Yves," cried Aramis, "come here, come here." Yves ran toward him, letting fall the cylinder which he was about to place under the boat when the bishop's call interrupted him. "What is the meaning of this hunt, skipper?" said Porthos.
"Eh, monseigneur, I cannot understand it," replied the Breton. "It is not at such a moment that the Seigneur de Locmaria would hunt. No, and yet the dogs."
"Unless they have escaped from the kennel."
"No," said Goenne, "they are not the Seigneur de Locmaria's hounds."
"In common prudence," said Aramis, "let us go back into the grotto. The voices evidently draw nearer. We shall soon know what we have to trust to." They re entered, but had scarcely proceeded 100 steps in the darkness, when a noise like the hoarse sigh of a creature in distress resounded through the cavern, and breathless, rapid, terrified, a fox passed like a flash of lightning before the fugitives, leaped over the boat, and disappeared, leaving behind its sour scent, which was perceptible for several seconds under the low vaults of the cave. "The fox!" cried the Bretons, with the glad surprise of born hunters. "Accursed mischance!" cried the bishop. Our retreat is discovered."
"How so?" said Porthos. "Are you afraid of a fox?"
"Eh? My friend, what do you mean by that? Why do you specify the fox? It is not the fox alone. Pardieu! But don't you know, Porthos, that after the foxes come hounds, and after hounds, men?" Porthos hung his head. As though to confirm the words of Aramis, they heard the yelping pack approach with frightful swiftness upon the trail. 6 foxhounds burst at once upon the little heath, with mingling yelps of triumph. "There are the dogs, plain enough," said Aramis, posted on the lookout, behind a chink in the rocks. "Now, who are the huntsmen?"
"If it is the Seigneur de Locmaria's," replied the sailor, "he will leave the dogs to hunt the grotto, for he knows them, and will not enter in himself, being quite sure that the fox will come out the other side. It is there he will wait for him."
"It is not the Seigneur de Locmaria who is hunting," replied Aramis, turning pale in spite of his efforts to maintain a placid countenance. "Who is it, then?" said Porthos. "Look." Porthos applied his eye to the slit, and saw at the summit of a hillock a dozen horsemen urging on their horses in the track of the dogs, shouting, "Taillot! Taillot!" "The guards!" said he. "Yes, my friend, the king's guards."
"The king's guards, do you say, monseigneur?" cried the Bretons, growing pale in turn.
"With Biscarrat at their head, mounted upon my gray horse," continued Aramis.
The hounds at the same moment rushed into the grotto like an avalanche, and the depths of the cavern were filled with their deafening cries.
"Ah, the devil!"
said Aramis, resuming all his coolness at the sight of this certain, inevitable danger.
"I am perfectly satisfied we are lost, but we have at least one chance left. If the guards who follow their hounds happen to discover there is an issue to the grotto, there is no help for us, for on entering they must see both ourselves and our boat. The dogs must not go out of the cavern. Their masters must not enter." "That is clear," said Porthos. "You understand," added Aramis, with the rapid precision of command. "There are 6 dogs that will be forced to stop at the great stone under which the fox has glided, but at the too narrow opening of which they must be themselves stopped and killed."
The Bretons sprang forward, knife in hand. In a few minutes there was a lamentable concert of angry barks and mortal howls, and then silence.
"That's well," said Aramis, coolly. "Now for the masters." "What is to be done with them?" said Porthos. "Wait their arrival, conceal ourselves, and kill them." "Kill them!" replied Porthos. "There are 16," said Aramis, "at least at present." "And well armed," added Porthos, with a smile of consolation. "It will last about 10 minutes," said Aramis. "To work!"
And with a resolute air he took up a musket and placed a hunting knife between his teeth.
"Yves, Goenne, and his son," continued Aramis, "will pass the muskets to us. You, Porthos, will fire when they are close. We shall have brought down, at the lowest computation, 8 before the others are aware of anything. That is certain. Then all, there are 5 of us, will dispatch the other 8, knife in hand." "And poor Biscarrat?" said Porthos.
Aramis reflected a moment.
"Biscarrat first," replied he, coolly. "He knows us."
Chapter 48. The Grotto. In spite of the sort of divination which was the remarkable side of the character of Aramis, the event, subject to the risks of things over which uncertainty presides, did not fall out exactly as the bishop of Vannes had foreseen. Biscarrat, better mounted than his companions, arrived first at the opening of the grotto, and comprehended that fox and hounds were one and all engulfed in it. Only, struck by that superstitious terror which every dark and subterraneous way naturally impresses upon the mind of man, he stopped at the outside of the grotto,
and waited till his companions should have assembled round him. "Well?" asked the young men, coming up out of breath, and unable to understand the meaning of this inaction. "Well, I cannot hear the dogs. They and the fox must all be lost in this infernal cavern." "They were too close up," said one of the guards, "to have lost scent all at once. Besides, we should hear them from one side or another. They must, as Biscarrat say, be in this grotto." "But then," said one of the young men, "why don't they give tongue?" "It is strange," muttered another. "Well, but," said a fourth, "let us go into this grotto." "Does it happen to be forbidden we should enter it?" "No," replied Biscarrat. "Only, as it looks as dark as a wolf's mouth, we might break our necks in it." "Witness the dogs," said a guard, "who seem to have broken theirs." "What the devil can have become of them?" asked the young men in chorus. And every master called his dog by his name, whistled to him in his favorite mode, without a single one replying to either call or whistle. "It is perhaps an enchanted grotto," said Biscarrat. "Let us see." And jumping from his horse, he made a step into the grotto. "Stop, stop, I will accompany you," said one of the guards, on seeing Biscarrat disappear in the shades of the cavern's mouth. "No," replied Biscarrat, "there must be something extraordinary in the place. Don't let us risk ourselves all at once. If in 10 minutes you do not hear of me, you can come in, but not all at once." "Be it so," said the young man, who, besides, did not imagine that Biscarrat ran much risk in the enterprise. "We will wait for you." And without dismounting from their horses, they formed a circle round the grotto. Biscarrat entered then alone, and advanced through the darkness till he came in contact with the muzzle of Porthos's musket. The resistance which his chest met with astonished him. He naturally raised his hand and laid hold of the icy barrel. At the same instant, Yves lifted a knife against the young man, who was about to fall upon him with all the force of a Breton's arm, when the iron wrist of Porthos stopped it halfway. Then, like low muttering thunder, his voice growled in the darkness, "I will not have him killed." Biscarrat found himself between a protection and a threat, the one almost as terrible as the other. However brave the young man might be, he could not prevent a cry escaping him, which Aramis immediately suppressed by placing a handkerchief over his mouth. "Monsieur de Biscarrat," said he, in a low voice, "we mean you no harm, and you must know that if you have recognized us, but at the first word, the first groan, the first whisper, we shall be forced to kill you as we have killed your dogs." "Yes, I recognize you, gentlemen," said the officer in a low voice. "But why are you here? What are you doing here? Unfortunate men, I thought you were in the fort." "And you, monsieur, you were to obtain conditions for us, I think." "I did all I was able, messieurs, but—" "But what?" "But there are positive orders." "To kill us?" Biscarrat made no reply. It would have cost him too much to speak of the cord to gentlemen. Aramis understood the silence of the prisoner. "Monsieur Biscarrat," said he, "you would be already dead if we had not regard for your youth and our ancient association with your father; but you may yet escape from the place by swearing that you will not tell your companions what you have seen." "I will not only swear that I will not speak of it," said Biscarrat, "but I still further swear that I will do everything in the world to prevent my companions from setting foot in the grotto." "Biscarrat! Biscarrat!" cried several voices from the outside, coming like a whirlwind into the cave. "Reply," said Aramis. "Here I am!" cried Biscarrat. "Now begone, we depend on your loyalty." And he left his hold of the young man, who hastily returned towards the light. "Biscarrat! Biscarrat!" cried the voices, still nearer, and the shadows of several human forms projected into the interior of the grotto. Biscarrat rushed to meet his friends in order to stop them, and met them just as they were adventuring into the cave. Aramis and Porthos listened with the intense attention of men whose life depends upon a breath of air. "Oh, oh!" exclaimed one of the guards, as he came to the light. "How pale you are!" "Pale!" cried another. "You ought to say corpse color." "Ay!" said the young man, endeavoring to collect his faculties. "In the name of Heaven, what has happened?" exclaimed all the voices. "You have not a drop of blood in your veins, my poor friend," said one of them, laughing. "Messieurs, it is nothing." "Messieurs, it is serious," said another. "He is going to faint. Does any one of you happen to have any salts?" And they all laughed. This hail of jests fell round Biscarrat's ears like musket balls in a melee. He recovered himself amidst a deluge of interrogations. "What do you suppose I have seen?" asked he. "I was too hot when I entered the grotto, and I have been struck with a chill. That is all." "But the dogs, have you seen them again? Did you see anything of them? Do you know anything about them?" "I suppose they have got out some other way." "Messieurs," said one of the young men, "there is in that which is going on, in the paleness and silence of our friend, a mystery which Biscarrat will not or cannot reveal. Only, and this is certain, Biscarrat has seen something in the grotto. Well, for my part, I am very curious to see what it is, even if it is the devil. To the grotto, monsieur, to the grotto!" "To the grotto!" repeated all the voices. And the echo of the cavern carried like a menace to Porthos and Aramis. "To the grotto! To the grotto!" Biscarrat threw himself before his companions. "Messieurs, messieurs!" cried he, "in the name of Heaven, do not go in!" "Why, what is there so terrific in the cavern?" asked several at once. "Come, speak, Biscarrat." "Decidedly, it is the devil he has seen," repeated he who had before advanced that hypothesis. "Well," said another, "if he has seen him, he need not be selfish; he may as well let us have a look at him in turn." "Messieurs, I beseech you," urged Biscarrat. "Nonsense! Let us pass." "Messieurs, I implore you not to enter." "Why? You went in yourself." Then one of the officers, who, of a riper age than the others, had till this time remained behind, and had said nothing, advanced. "Messieurs," said he, with a calmness which contrasted with the animation of the young men, "there is in there some person, or something, that is not the devil, but which, whatever it may be, has had sufficient power to silence our dogs. We must discover who this someone is, or what this something is." Biscarrat made a last effort to stop his friends, but it was useless. In vain he threw himself before the rashest, in vain he clung to the rocks to bar the passage. The crowd of young men rushed into the cave, in the steps of the officer who had spoken last, but who had sprung in first, sword in hand, to face the unknown danger. Biscarrat, repulsed by his friends, unable to accompany them, without passing in the eyes of Porthos and Aramis for a traitor and a perjurer, with painfully attentive ear and unconsciously supplicating hands, leaned against the rough side of a rock which he thought must be exposed to the fire of the musketeers. As to the guards, they penetrated further and further, with exclamations that grew fainter as they advanced. All at once, a discharge of musketry, growling like thunder, exploded in the entrails of the vault. 2 or 3 balls were flattened against the rock on which Biscarrat was leaning. At the same instant, cries, shrieks, imprecations burst forth, and the little troop of gentlemen reappeared, some pale, some bleeding, all enveloped in a cloud of smoke, which the outer air seemed to suck from the depths of the cavern. "Biscarrat! Biscarrat!" cried the fugitives. "You knew there was an ambuscade in that cavern, and you did not warn us!
Biscarrat, you are the cause that 4 of us are murdered men. Woe be to you, Biscarrat!" "You are the cause of my being wounded unto death," said one of the young men, letting a gush of scarlet lifeblood vomit in his palm, and spattering into Biscarrat's livid face. "My blood be on your head!" And he rolled in agony at the feet of the young man. "But at least tell us who is there!" cried several furious voices. Biscarrat remained silent. "Tell us or die!" cried the wounded man, raising himself upon one knee, and lifting towards his companion an arm bearing a useless sword. Biscarrat rushed towards him, opening his breast for the blow, but the wounded man fell back not to rise again, uttering a groan which was his last. Biscarrat, with hair on end, haggard eyes, and bewildered head, advanced towards the interior of the cavern, saying, "You are right. Death to me, who have allowed my comrades to be assassinated. I am a worthless wretch." And throwing away his sword, for he wished to die without defending himself, he rushed head foremost into the cavern. The others followed him. The 11 who remained out of 16 imitated his example, but they did not go further than the first. A second discharge laid 5 upon the icy sand, and as it was impossible to see whence this murderous thunder issued, the others fell back with a terror that can be better imagined than described. But far from flying, as the others had done, Biscarrat remained safe and sound, seated on a fragment of rock, and waited. There were only 6 gentlemen left. "Seriously," said one of the survivors, "is it the devil?" "Ma foi, it is much worse," said another. "Ask Biscarrat, he knows." "Where is Biscarrat?" The young men looked round them, and saw that Biscarrat did not answer. "He is dead," said 2 or 3 voices. "Oh, no," replied another. "I saw him through the smoke, sitting quietly on a rock. He is in the cavern. He is waiting for us." "He must know who are there." "And how should he know them?" "He was taken prisoner by the rebels." "That is true. Well, let us call him and learn from him whom we have to deal with." And all voices shouted, "Biscarrat! Biscarrat!" But Biscarrat did not answer. "Good," said the officer who had shown so much coolness in the affair. "We have no longer any need of him. Here are reinforcements coming." In fact, a company of guards, left in the rear by their officers, whom the ardor of the chase had carried away, from 75 to 80 men, arrived in good order, led by their captain and the first lieutenant. The 5 officers hastened to meet their soldiers, and, in language the eloquence of which may be easily imagined, they related the adventure and asked for aid. The captain interrupted them. "Where are your companions?" demanded he. "Dead." "But there were 16 of you." "10 are dead. Biscarrat's in the cavern, and we are 5. "Biscarrat is a prisoner?" "Probably." "No, for here he is, look." In fact, Biscarrat appeared at the opening of the grotto. "He is making a sign to come on," said the officer. "Come on." "Come on!" cried all the troop, and they advanced to meet Biscarrat. "Monsieur," said the captain, addressing Biscarrat, "I am assured that you know who the men are in that grotto, and who make such a desperate defense. In the king's name, I command you to declare what you know." "Captain," said Biscarrat, "you have no need to command me. My word has been restored to me this very instant, and I came in the name of these men." "To tell me who they are?" "To tell you they are determined to defend themselves to the death, unless you grant them satisfactory terms." "How many are there of them, then?" "There are 2," said Biscarrat. "There are 2, and want to impose conditions upon us?" "There are 2, and they have already killed 10 of our men." "What sort of people are they? Giants?" worse than that. Do you remember the history of the Bastion Saint Gervais, captain?"
"Yes, where 4 musketeers held out against an army."
"Well, these are 2 of those same musketeers."
"And their names?"
"At that period, they were called Porthos and Aramis. Now they are styled Monsieur d'Herblay and Monsieur du Vallon."
"And what interest have they in all this?"
"It is they who were holding Belle Isle for M. Fouquet." A murmur ran through the ranks of the soldiers on hearing the 2 words, Porthos and Aramis. "The musketeers! The musketeers!" repeated they. And among all these brave men, the idea that they were going to have a struggle against 2 of the oldest glories of the French army made a shiver, half enthusiasm, 2/3 terror, run through them. In fact, those 4 names, D'Artagnan, Athos, Porthos, and Aramis, were venerated among all who wore a sword, as, in antiquity, the names of Hercules, Theseus, Castor, and Pollux were venerated. "2 men, and they have killed 10 in 2 discharges. It is impossible, Monsieur Biscarrat." "Eh, captain?" replied the latter. "I do not tell you that they have not with them 2 or 3 men, as the musketeers of the Bastion Saint Gervais had 2 or 3 lackeys; but believe me, captain, I have seen these men, I have been taken prisoner by them, I know they themselves alone are all sufficient to destroy an army."
"That we shall see," said the captain, "and that in a moment, too. Gentlemen, attention!"
At this reply, no one stirred, and all prepared to obey. Biscarrat alone risked a last attempt. "Monsieur," said he, in a low voice, "be persuaded by me. Let us pass on our way. Those 2 men, those 2 lions you are going to attack, will defend themselves to the death. They have already killed 10 of our men. They will kill double the number, and end by killing themselves rather than surrender. What shall we gain by fighting them?" "We shall gain the consciousness, monsieur, of not having allowed 80 of the king's guards to retire before 2 rebels. If I listened to your advice, monsieur, I should be a dishonored man, and by dishonoring myself I should dishonor the army. Forward, my men!" And he marched first as far as the opening of the grotto. There he halted. The object of this halt was to give Biscarrat and his companions time to describe to him the interior of the grotto. Then, when he believed he had a sufficient acquaintance with the place, he divided his company into 3 bodies, which were to enter successively, keeping up a sustained fire in all directions. No doubt, in this attack they would lose 5 more, perhaps 10, but certainly they must end by taking the rebels, since there was no issue, and at any rate 2 men could not kill 80. "Captain," said Biscarrat, "I beg to be allowed to march at the head of the first platoon." "So be it," replied the captain. "You have all the honor. I make you a present of it." "Thanks," replied the young man, with all the firmness of his race. "Take your sword, then." "I shall go as I am, captain," said Biscarrat, "for I do not go to kill, I go to be killed." And placing himself at the head of the first platoon, with head uncovered and arms crossed, "March, gentlemen," said he.
Chapter 49. An Homeric Song. It is time to pass to the other camp, and to describe at once the combatants and the field of battle. Aramis and Porthos had gone to the grotto of Locmaria with the expectation of finding there their canoe, ready armed, as well as the 3 Bretons, their assistants; and they at first hoped to make the bark pass through the little issue of the cavern, concealing in that fashion both their labors and their flight. The arrival of the fox and dogs obliged them to remain concealed. The grotto extended the space of about 100 toises, to that little slope dominating a creek. Formerly a temple of the Celtic divinities, when Belle Isle was still called Chalonnaise, This grotto had beheld more than one human sacrifice accomplished in its mystic depths. The first entrance to the cavern was by a moderate descent, above which distorted rocks formed a weird arcade. The interior, very uneven and dangerous from the inequalities of the vault, was subdivided into several compartments, which communicated with each other by means of rough and jagged steps, fixed right and left, in uncouth natural pillars. At the third compartment the vault was so low, the passage so narrow, that the bark would scarcely have passed without touching the side. Nevertheless, in moments of despair, wood softens, and stone grows flexible beneath the human will. Such was the thought of Aramis, when, after having fought the fight, he decided upon flight, a flight most dangerous, since all the assailants were not dead, and that, admitting the possibility of putting the bark to sea, they would have to fly in open day, before the conquered, so interested on recognizing their small number, in pursuing their conquerors. When the 2 discharges had killed 10 men, Aramis, familiar with the windings of the cavern, went to reconnoitre them one by one, and counted them, for the smoke prevented seeing outside, and he immediately commanded that the canoe should be rolled as far as the great stone, the closure of the liberating issue. Porthos collected all his strength, took the canoe in his arms, and raised it up, whilst the Bretons made it run rapidly along the rollers. They had descended into the third compartment, they had arrived at the stone which walled the outlet. Porthos seized this gigantic stone at its base, applied his robust shoulder, and gave a heave which made the wall crack. A cloud of dust fell from the vault, with the ashes of 10,000 generations of sea birds, whose nests stuck like cement to the rock. At the third shock, the stone gave way and oscillated for a minute. Porthos, placing his back against the neighboring rock, made an arch with his foot, which drove the block out of the calcareous masses which served for hinges and cramps. The stone fell, and daylight was visible, brilliant, radiant, flooding the cavern through the opening, and the blue sea appeared to the delighted Bretons. They began to lift the bark over the barricade. 20 more toises, and it would glide into the ocean. It was during this time that the company arrived, was drawn up by the captain, and disposed for either an escalade or an assault. Aramis watched over everything, to favor the labors of his friends. He saw the reinforcements, counted the men, and convinced himself at a single glance of the insurmountable peril to which fresh combat would expose them. To escape by sea, at the moment the cavern was about to be invaded, was impossible. In fact, the daylight which had just been admitted to the last compartments had exposed to the soldiers the bark being rolled towards the sea, the 2 rebels within musket shot, and one of their discharges would riddle the boat if it did not kill the navigators. Besides, allowing everything, if the bark escaped with the men on board of it, how could the alarm be suppressed? How could notice to the royal lighters be prevented? What could hinder the poor canoe, followed by sea and watched from the shore, from succumbing before the end of the day? Aramis, digging his hands into his gray hair with rage, invoked the assistance of God and the assistance of the demons. Calling to Porthos, who was doing more work than all the rollers, whether of flesh or wood, "My friend," said he, "our adversaries have just received a reinforcement." "Ah, ah," said Porthos quietly. "What is to be done, then?" "To recommence the combat," said Aramis, "is hazardous." "Yes," said Porthos, "for it is difficult to suppose that out of 2 one should not be killed, and certainly, if one of us was killed, the other would get himself killed also." Porthos spoke these words with that heroic nature which, with him, grew grander with necessity. Aramis felt it like a spur to his heart. "We shall neither of us be killed if you do what I tell you, friend Porthos." "Tell me what?" "These people are coming down into the grotto." "Yes." "We could kill about 15 of them, but no more." "How many are there in all?" asked Porthos. They have received a reinforcement of 75 men. 75 and 5, 80. Ah!" sighed Porthos. "If they fire all at once, they will riddle us with balls." "Certainly they will." "Without reckoning," added Aramis, "that the detonation might occasion a collapse of the cavern." "Ay," said Porthos, "a piece of falling rock just now grazed my shoulder." "You see, then." "Oh, it is nothing." "We must determine upon something quickly. Our Bretons are going to continue to roll the canoe towards the sea." "Very well." "We two will keep the powder, the balls, and the muskets here." "But only two, my dear Aramis. We shall never fire 3 shots together," said Porthos, innocently. "The defense by musketry is a bad one." "Find a better, then." "I have found one," said the giant, eagerly. "I will place myself in ambuscade behind the pillar with this iron bar, and invisible, unattackable. If they come in floods, I can let my bar fall upon their skulls 30 times in a minute. Hein, what do you think of the project? You smile." "Excellent, dear friend, perfect. I approve it greatly. Only you will frighten them, and half of them will remain outside to take us by famine. What we want, my good friend, is the entire destruction of the troop. A single survivor encompasses our ruin." "You are right, my friend; but how can we attract them, pray?" "By not stirring, my good Porthos." "Well, we won't stir, then; but when they are all together—" "Then leave it to me. I have an idea." "If it is so, and your idea proves a good one, and your idea is most likely to be good, I am satisfied." "To your ambuscade, Porthos, and count how many enter." "But you, what will you do?" "Don't trouble yourself about me. I have a task to perform." "I think I hear shouts." "It is they. To your post. Keep within reach of my voice and hand." Porthos took refuge in the second compartment, which was in darkness, absolutely black. Aramis glided into the third. The giant held in his hand an iron bar of about 50 pounds weight. Porthos handled this lever, which had been used in rolling the bark, with marvelous facility. During this time, the Bretons had pushed the bark to the beach. In the further and lighter compartment, Aramis, stooping and concealed, was busy with some mysterious maneuver. A command was given in a loud voice. It was the last order of the captain commandant. 25 men jumped from the upper rocks into the first compartment of the grotto, and having taken their ground, began to fire. The echoes shrieked and barked. The hissing balls seemed actually to rarefy the air, and then opaque smoke filled the vault. "To the left! To the left!" cried Biscarrat, who in his first assault had seen the passage to the second chamber, and who, animated by the smell of powder, wished to guide his soldiers in that direction. The troop, accordingly, precipitated themselves to the left, the passage gradually growing narrower. Biscarrat, with his hands stretched forward, devoted to death, marched in advance of the muskets. "Come on! Come on!" exclaimed he. "I see daylight." "Strike, Porthos!" came the sepulchral voice of Aramis. Porthos breathed a heavy sigh, but he obeyed. The iron bar fell full and direct upon the head of Biscarrat, who was dead before he had ended his cry. Then the formidable lever rose 10 times in 10 seconds, and made 10 corpses. The soldiers could see nothing. They heard sighs and groans. They stumbled over dead bodies, but as they had no conception of the cause of all this, they came forward, jostling each other. The implacable bar, still falling, annihilated the first platoon, without a single sound to warn the second, which was quietly advancing. Only, commanded by the captain, the men had stripped a fir growing on the shore, and with its resinous branches twisted together, the captain had made a flambeau. On arriving at the compartment where Porthos, like the exterminating angel, had destroyed all he touched, the first rank drew back in terror. No firing had replied to that of the guards, and yet their way was stopped by a heap of dead bodies. They literally walked in blood. Porthos was still behind his pillar. The captain, illumining with trembling pine torch this frightful carnage, of which he in vain sought the cause, drew back towards the pillar behind which Porthos was concealed. Then a gigantic hand issued from the shade and fastened on the throat of the captain, who uttered a stifled rattle, his stretched out arms beating the air. The torch fell and was extinguished in blood. A second after, the corpse of the captain dropped close to the extinguished torch, and added another body to the heap of dead which blocked up the passage. All this was effected as mysteriously as though by magic. At hearing the rattling in the throat of the captain, the soldiers who accompanied him had turned round, caught a glimpse of his extended arms, his eyes starting from their sockets, and then the torch fell, and they were left in darkness. From an unreflective, instinctive, mechanical feeling, the lieutenant cried, "Fire!" Immediately a volley of musketry flamed, thundered, roared in the cavern, bringing down enormous fragments from the vaults. The cavern was lighted for an instant by this discharge, and then immediately returned to pitchy darkness, rendered thicker by the smoke. To this succeeded a profound silence, broken only by the steps of the 3rd Brigade, now entering the cavern. Chapter 50. The Death of a Titan. At the moment when Porthos, more accustomed to the darkness than these men coming from open daylight, was looking round him to see if through this artificial midnight Aramis were not making him some signal, he felt his arm gently touched, and a voice low as a breath murmured in his ear, "Come." "Oh!" said Porthos. "Hush!" said Aramis, if possible, yet more softly. And amidst the noise of the 3rd Brigade, which continued to advance, the imprecations of the guards still left alive, the muffled groans of the dying, Aramis and Porthos glided unseen along the granite walls of the cavern. Aramis led Porthos into the last but one compartment, and showed him, in a hollow of the rocky wall, a barrel of powder weighing from 70 to 80 pounds, to which he had just attached a fuse. "My friend," said he to Porthos, "you will take this barrel, the match of which I am going to set fire to, and throw it amidst our enemies. Can you do so?" "Parbleu!" replied Porthos, and he lifted the barrel with one hand. "Light it." "Stop," said Aramis, "till they are all massed together, and then, my Jupiter, hurl your thunderbolt among them." "Light it!" repeated Porthos. "On my part," continued Aramis, "I will join our Bretons, and help them to get the canoe to the sea. I will wait for you on the shore, launch it strongly, and hasten to us." "Light it!" said Porthos a third time. "But do you understand me?" "Parbleu!" said Porthos again, with laughter that he did not even attempt to restrain. "When a thing is explained to me, I understand it. Begone, and give me the light." Aramis gave the burning match to Porthos, who held out his arm to him, his hands being engaged. Aramis pressed the arm of Porthos with both his hands, and fell back to the outlet of the cavern, where the 3 rowers awaited him. Porthos, left alone, applied the spark bravely to the match. The spark, a feeble spark, first principle of conflagration, shone in the darkness like a glowworm, then was deadened against the match which it set fire to, Porthos enlivening the flame with his breath. The smoke was a little dispersed, and by the light of the sparkling match objects might, for 2 seconds, be distinguished. It was a brief but splendid spectacle, that of this giant, pale, bloody, his countenance lighted by the fire of the match burning in surrounding darkness. The soldiers saw him. They saw the barrel he held in his hand. They at once understood what was going to happen. Then these men, already choked with horror at the sight of what had been accomplished, filled with terror at the thought of what was about to be accomplished, gave out a simultaneous shriek of agony. Some endeavored to fly, but they encountered the 3rd Brigade, which barred their passage. Others mechanically took aim and attempted to fire their discharged muskets. Others fell instinctively upon their knees. 2 or 3 officers cried out to Porthos to promise him his liberty if he would spare their lives. The lieutenant of the 3rd Brigade commanded his men to fire, but the guards had before them their terrified companions, who served as a living rampart for Porthos. We have said that the light produced by the spark and the match did not last more than 2 seconds, but during these 2 seconds that is what it illumined. In the first place, the giant, enlarged in the darkness; then, at 10 paces off, a heap of bleeding bodies, crushed, mutilated, in the midst of which some still heaved in the last agony, lifting the mass as a last respiration, inflating the sides of some old monster dying in the night. Every breath of Porthos, thus vivifying the match, sent towards this heap of bodies a phosphorescent aura, mingled with streaks of purple. In addition to this principal group scattered about the grotto, as the chances of death or surprise had stretched them, isolated bodies seemed to be making ghastly exhibitions of their gaping wounds. Above ground, bedded in pools of blood, rose, heavy and sparkling, the short, thick pillars of the cavern, of which the strongly marked shades threw out the luminous particles. And all this was seen by the tremulous light of a match attached to a barrel of powder, that is to say, a torch which, whilst throwing a light on the dead past, showed death to come. As I have said, this spectacle did not last above 2 seconds. During this short space of time, an officer of the 3rd Brigade got together 8 men armed with muskets, and, through an opening, ordered them to fire upon Porthos. But they who received the order to fire trembled so that 3 guards fell by the discharge, and the 5 remaining balls hissed on to splinter the vault, plough the ground, or indent the pillars of the cavern. A burst of laughter replied to this volley, then the arm of the giant swung round, then was seen whirling through the air, like a falling star, the train of fire. The barrel, hurled a distance of 30 feet, cleared the barricade of dead bodies, and fell amidst a group of shrieking soldiers, who threw themselves on their faces. The officer had followed the brilliant train in the air; he endeavored to precipitate himself upon the barrel and tear out the match before it reached the powder it contained. Useless. The air had made the flame attached to the conductor more active. The match, which at rest might have burnt 5 minutes, was consumed in 30 seconds, and the infernal work exploded. Furious vortices of sulphur and nitre, devouring shoals of fire which caught every object, the terrible thunder of the explosion, this is what the second which followed disclosed in that cavern of horrors. The rocks split like planks of deal beneath the axe. A jet of fire, smoke, and debris sprang from the middle of the grotto, enlarging as it mounted. The large walls of silex tottered and fell upon the sand, and the sand itself, an instrument of pain when launched from its hard bed, riddled the faces with its myriad cutting atoms. Shrieks, imprecations, human life, dead bodies, all were engulfed in one terrific crash. The first 3 compartments became one sepulchral sink into which fell grimly back, in the order of their weight, every vegetable, mineral, or human fragment. Then the lighter sand and ash came down in turn, stretching like a winding sheet, and smoking over the dismal scene. And now, in this burning tomb, this subterranean volcano, seek the king's guards with their blue coats laced with silver, seek the officers, brilliant in gold, seek for the arms upon which they depended for their defense. One single man has made of all these things a chaos more confused, more shapeless, more terrible, than the chaos which existed before the creation of the world. There remained nothing of the 3 compartments, nothing by which God could have recognized his handiwork. As for Porthos, after having hurled the barrel of powder amidst his enemies, he had fled, as Aramis had directed him to do, and had gained the last compartment, into which air, light, and sunshine penetrated through the opening. Scarcely had he turned the angle which separated the 3rd compartment from the 4th, when he perceived at 100 paces from him the bark dancing on the waves. There were his friends, their liberty, their life and victory. 6 more of his formidable strides, and he would be out of the vault, out of the vault. A dozen of his vigorous leaps, and he would reach the canoe. Suddenly, he felt his knees give way. His knees seemed powerless, his legs to yield beneath him. "Oh, oh!" murmured he, "there is my weakness seizing me again. I can walk no further. What is this?" Aramis perceived him through the opening, and unable to conceive what could induce him to stop thus. "Come on, Porthos, come on!" he cried. "Come quickly!" "Oh!" replied the giant, making an effort that contorted every muscle of his body. "Oh, but I cannot!" While saying these words he fell upon his knees, but with his mighty hands he clung to the rocks and raised himself up again. "Quick, quick!" repeated Aramis, bending forward towards the shore, as if to draw Porthos towards him with his arms. "Here I am!" staggered Porthos, collecting all his strength to make one step more. "In the name of Heaven! Porthos, make haste! The barrel will blow up!" "Make haste, monseigneur!" shouted the Bretons to Porthos, who was floundering as in a dream. But there was no time. The explosion thundered, earth gaped, the smoke which hurled through the clefts obscured the sky, the sea flowed back as though driven by the blast of flame which darted from the grotto, as if from the jaws of some gigantic fiery chimera. The reflux took the bark out 20 toises. The solid rocks cracked to their base, and separated like blocks beneath the operation of the wedge. A portion of the vault was carried up towards heaven, as if it had been built of cardboard. The green and blue and topaz conflagration and black lava of liquefactions clashed and combated an instant beneath a majestic dome of smoke, then oscillated, declined, and fell successively the mighty monoliths of rock which the violence of the explosion had not been able to uproot from the bed of ages. They bowed to each other like grave and stiff old men, then, prostrating themselves, lay down forever in their dusty tomb. This frightful shock seemed to restore Porthos the strength that he had lost. He arose, a giant among granite giants. But at the moment he was flying between the double hedge of granite phantoms. These latter, which were no longer supported by the corresponding links, began to roll and totter round our Titan, who looked as if precipitated from heaven amidst rocks which he had just been launching. Porthos felt the very earth beneath his feet becoming jelly tremulous. He stretched both hands to repulse the falling rocks. A gigantic block was held back by each of his extended arms. He bent his head, and a third granite mass sank between his shoulders. For an instant, the power of Porthos seemed about to fail him, but this new Hercules united all his force, and the 2 walls of the prison in which he was buried fell back slowly and gave him place. For an instant he appeared, in this frame of granite, like the angel of chaos, but in pushing back the lateral rocks, he lost his point of support, for the monolith which weighed upon his shoulders, and the boulder, pressing upon him with all its weight, brought the giant down upon his knees. The lateral rocks, for an instant pushed back, drew together again, and added their weight to the ponderous mass which would have been sufficient to crush 10 men. The hero fell without a groan. He fell while answering Aramis with words of encouragement and hope, for, thanks to the powerful arch of his hands, for an instant he believed that, like Enceladus, he would succeed in shaking off the triple load. But by degrees Aramis beheld the block sink. The hands, strung for an instant, the arms stiffened for a last effort, gave way, the extended shoulders sank, wounded and torn, and the rocks continued to gradually collapse. "Porthos! Porthos!" cried Aramis, tearing his hair. "Porthos! Where are you? Speak!" "Here, here," murmured Porthos, with a voice growing evidently weaker. "Patience, patience. Scarcely had he pronounced these words when the impulse of the fall augmented the weight. The enormous rock sank down, pressed by those others which sank in from the sides, and, as it were, swallowed up Porthos in a sepulchre of badly jointed stones. On hearing the dying voice of his friend, Aramis had sprung to land. Two of the Bretons followed him, with each a lever in his hand, one being sufficient to take care of the bark. The dying rattle of the valiant gladiator guided them amidst the ruins. Aramis, animated, active, and young as at 20, sprang towards the triple mass, and with his hands, delicate as those of a woman, raised by a miracle of strength the cornerstone of this great granite grave. Then he caught a glimpse, through the darkness of that charnel house, of the still brilliant eye of his friend, to whom the momentary lifting of the mass restored a momentary respiration. The two men came rushing up, grasped their iron levers, united their triple strength, not merely to raise it, but sustain it. All was useless. They gave way with cries of grief, and the rough voice of Porthos, seeing them exhaust themselves in a useless struggle, murmured in an almost cheerful tone those supreme words which came to his lips with the last respiration: "Too heavy." After which his eyes darkened and closed, his face grew ashy pale, the hands whitened, and the colossus sank quite down, breathing his last sigh. With him sank the rock, which, even in his dying agony, he had still held up. The three men dropped the levers, which rolled upon the tumulary stone. Then, breathless, pale, his brow covered with sweat, Aramis listened, his breast oppressed, his heart ready to break. Nothing more. The giant slept the eternal sleep, in the sepulchre which God had built about him to his measure. Chapter 51. Porthos' Epitaph. Aramis, silent and sad as ice, trembling like a timid child, arose shivering from the stone. A Christian does not walk on tombs, but, though capable of standing, he was not capable of walking. It might be said that something of dead Porthos had just died within him. His Bretons surrounded him. Aramis yielded to their kind exertions, and the three sailors, lifting him up, carried him to the canoe. Then, having laid him down upon the bench near the rudder, they took to their oars, preferring this to hoisting sail, which might betray them. On all that leveled surface of the ancient grotto of Locmaria, one single hillock attracted their eyes. Aramis never removed his from it, and at a distance out in the sea, in proportion as the shore receded, that menacing proud mass of rock seemed to draw itself up, as formerly Porthos used to draw himself up, raising a smiling yet invincible head towards heaven, like that of his dear old honest, valiant friend, the strongest of the four, yet the first dead. Strange destiny of these men of brass! The most simple of heart allied to the most crafty, strength of body guided by subtlety of mind, and in the decisive moment, when vigor alone could save mind and body, a stone, a rock, a vile material weight, triumphed over manly strength, and falling upon the body, drove out the mind. Worthy Porthos, born to help other men, always ready to sacrifice himself for the safety of the weak, as if God had only given him strength for that purpose. When dying, he only thought he was carrying out the conditions of his compact with Aramis, a compact, however, which Aramis alone had drawn up, and which Porthos had only known to suffer by its terrible solidarity. Noble Porthos, of what good now are thy chateaux, overflowing with sumptuous furniture, forests overflowing with game, lakes overflowing with fish, cellars overflowing with wealth? Of what service to thee now thy lackeys in brilliant liveries, and in the midst of them Mousqueton, proud of the power delegated by thee? Oh, noble Porthos, careful heaper up of treasure, was it worth while to labor to sweeten and gild life, to come upon a desert shore, surrounded by the cries of sea gulls, and lay thyself, with broken bones, beneath the torpid stone? Was it worth while, in short, noble Porthos, to heap so much gold, and not have even the distich of a poor poet engraven upon thy monument? Valiant Porthos! He still, without doubt, sleeps, lost, forgotten, beneath the rock the shepherds of the heath take for the gigantic abode of a dolmen, and so many twining branches, so many mosses, bent by the bitter wind of ocean, so many lichens solder thy sepulchre to earth, that no passers-by will imagine such a block of granite could ever have been supported by the shoulders of one man. Aramis, still pale, still icy cold, his heart upon his lips, looked even till, with the last ray of daylight, the shore faded on the horizon. Not a word escaped him, not a sigh rose from his deep breast. The superstitious Bretons looked upon him trembling. Such silence was not that of a man, it was the silence of a statue. In the meantime, with the first grey lines that lighted up the heavens, the canoe hoisted its little sail, which, swelling with the kisses of the breeze, and carrying them rapidly from the coast, made bravest way towards Spain, across the dreaded Gulf of Gascony, so rife with storms. But scarcely half an hour after the sail had been hoisted, the rowers became inactive, reclining on their benches, and making an eye shade with their hands, pointed out to each other a white spot which appeared on the horizon as motionless as a gull rocked by the viewless respiration of the waves. But that which might have appeared motionless to ordinary eyes was moving at a quick rate to the experienced eye of the sailor. That which appeared stationary upon the ocean was cutting a rapid way through it. For some time, seeing the profound torpor in which their master was plunged, they did not dare to rouse him, and satisfied themselves with exchanging their conjectures in whispers. Aramis, in fact, so vigilant, so active, Aramis, whose eye, like that of the lynx, watched without ceasing, and saw better by night than by day, Aramis seemed to sleep in this despair of soul. An hour passed thus, during which daylight gradually disappeared, but during which also the sail in view gained so swiftly on the bark, that Goenne, one of the three sailors, ventured to say aloud, "Monseigneur, we are being chased." Aramis made no reply. The ship still gained upon them. Then, of their own accord, two of the sailors, by the direction of the patron Yves, lowered the sail, in order that that single point upon the surface of the waters should cease to be a guide to the eye of the enemy pursuing them. On the part of the ship in sight, on the contrary, two more small sails were run up at the extremities of the masts. Unfortunately, it was the time of the finest and longest days of the year, and the moon, in all her brilliancy, succeeded inauspicious daylight. The balancelle, which was pursuing the little bark before the wind, had then still half an hour of twilight, and a whole night almost as light as day. "Monseigneur, monseigneur, we are lost," said the captain. "Look, they see us plainly, though we have lowered sail." "That is not to be wondered at," murmured one of the sailors, "since they say that, by the aid of the devil, the Paris folk have fabricated instruments with which they see as well at a distance as near, by night as well as by day." Aramis took a telescope from the bottom of the boat, focused it silently, and passing it to the sailor, "Here," said he, "look." The sailor hesitated. "Don't be alarmed," said the bishop. "There is no sin in it, and if there is any sin, I will take it on myself." The sailor lifted the glass to his eye, and uttered a cry. He believed that the vessel, which appeared to be distant about cannon shot, had at a single bound cleared the whole distance; but, on withdrawing the instrument from his eye, he saw that, except the way which the balancelle had been able to make during that brief instant, It was still at the same distance.
So, murmured the sailor, they can see us as we see them.
They see us, said Aramis, and sank again into impassibility.
What? They see us? Said Yves. Impossible.
Well, captain, look yourself, said the sailor, and he passed him the glass.
Monseigneur assures me that the devil has nothing to do with this? asked Yves.
Aramis shrugged his shoulders. The skipper lifted the glass to his eye.
Oh, monseigneur, said he, it is a miracle. There they are. It seems as if I were going to touch them. 25 men at least. Ah, I see the captain forward. He holds a glass like this and is looking at us. Ah, he turns round and gives an order. They are rolling a piece of cannon forward. They are loading it, pointing it. Misericorde, they are firing at us!
And by a mechanical movement, the skipper put aside the telescope, and the pursuing ship, relegated to the horizon, appeared again in its true aspect. The vessel was still at the distance of nearly a league, but the maneuver sighted thus was not less real. A light cloud of smoke appeared beneath the sails, more blue than they, and spreading like a flower opening. Then, at about a mile from the little canoe, they saw the ball take the crown off 2 or 3 waves, dig a white furrow in the sea, and disappear at the end of it, as inoffensive as the stone with which, in play, a boy makes ducks and drakes. It was at once a menace and a warning.
What is to be done? asked the patron.
They will sink us, said Goenne.
Give us absolution, monseigneur.
And the sailors fell on their knees before him. You forget that they can see you, said he.
That is true, said the sailors, ashamed of their weakness. Give us your orders, monseigneur. We are prepared to die for you.
Let us wait, said Aramis.
How? Let us wait.
Yes, do you not see, as you just now said, that if we endeavor to fly, they will sink us?
But perhaps, the patron ventured to say, perhaps under cover of night we could escape them?
Oh, said Aramis, they have, no doubt, Greek fire with which to lighten their own course, and ours likewise. At the same moment, as if the vessel was responsive to the appeal of Aramis, a second cloud of smoke mounted slowly to the heavens, and from the bosom of that cloud sparkled an arrow of flame, which described a parabola like a rainbow, and fell into the sea, where it continued to burn, illuminating a space of 1/4 of a league in diameter. The Bretons looked at each other in terror. You see plainly, said Aramis, it will be better to wait for them. The oars dropped from the hands of the sailors, and the bark, ceasing to make way, rocked motionless upon the summits of the waves. Night came on, but still the ship drew nearer. It might be imagined it redoubled its speed with darkness. From time to time, as a vulture rears his head out of its nest, the formidable Greek fire darted from its sides, and cast its flame upon the ocean like an incandescent snowfall. At last, it came within musket shot. All the men were on deck, arms in hand. The cannoneers were at their guns, the matches burning. It might be thought they were about to board a frigate and to fight a crew superior in number to their own, not to attempt the capture of a canoe manned by 4 people. "Surrender!" cried the commander of the Balancelle, with the aid of his speaking trumpet. The sailors looked at Aramis. Aramis made a sign with his head. Yves waved a white cloth at the end of a gaff. This was like striking their flag. The pursuer came on like a racehorse. It launched a fresh Greek fire, which fell within 20 paces of the little canoe, and threw a light upon them as white as sunshine. "At the first sign of resistance," cried the commander of the Balancelle, "fire!" The soldiers brought their muskets to the present. "Did we not say we surrendered?" said Yves. "Alive! alive, captain!" cried one excited soldier. "They must be taken alive!" Well, yes, living, said the captain. Then, turning toward the Bretons, "Your lives are safe, my friends," cried he. "All but the Chevalier d'Herblay." Aramis stared imperceptibly. For an instant his eye was fixed upon the depths of the ocean, illumined by the last flashes of the Greek fire, which ran along the sides of the waves, played on the crests like plumes, and rendered still darker and more terrible the gulfs they covered. "Do you hear, monseigneur?" said the sailors. "Yes." "What are your orders?" "Accept." "But you, monseigneur?" Aramis leaned still more forward, and dipped the ends of his long white fingers in the green limpid waters of the sea, to which he turned with smiles, as to a friend. "Accept," repeated he. "We accept," repeated the sailors. "But what security have we?" "The word of a gentleman," said the officer. "By my rank and by my name, I swear that all except Monsieur de Chevalier d'Herblay shall have their lives spared. I am lieutenant of the king's frigate the Pomona, and my name is Louis Constant de Pressigny." With a rapid gesture, Aramis, already bent over the side of the bark towards the sea, drew himself up, and with a flashing eye and a smile upon his lips, "Throw out the ladder, messieurs," said he, as if the command had belonged to him. He was obeyed. When Aramis, seizing the rope ladder, walked straight up to the commander, with a firm step, looked at him earnestly, made a sign to him with his hand, a mysterious and unknown sign, at sight of which the officer turned pale, trembled, and bowed his head, the sailors were profoundly astonished. Without a word, Aramis then raised his hand to the eyes of the commander, and showed him the collet of a ring he wore on the ring finger of his left hand. And while making this sign, Aramis, draped in cold and haughty majesty, had the air of an emperor giving his hand to be kissed. The commandant, who for a moment had raised his head, bowed a second time with marks of the most profound respect. Then stretching his hand out, in his turn, towards the poop, that is to say, towards his own cabin, he drew back to allow Aramis to go first. The three Bretons, who had come on board after their bishop, looked at each other, stupefied. The crew were awed to silence. 5 minutes after, the commander called the second lieutenant, who returned immediately, ordering the head to be put towards Corona. Whilst this order was being executed, Aramis reappeared upon the deck, and took a seat near the bastingage. Night had fallen. The moon had not yet risen, yet Aramis looked incessantly towards Belle Isle. Yves then approached the captain, who had returned to take his post in the stern, and said, in a low and humble voice, "What course are we to follow, captain?" "We take what course monseigneur pleases," replied the officer. Aramis passed the night leaning upon the bastingage. Yves, on approaching him next morning, remarked that the night must have been a very damp one, for the wood on which the bishop's head had rested was soaked with dew. Who knows? That dew was, it may be, the first tears that had ever fallen from the eyes of Aramis. What epitaph would have been worth that, good Porthos? Chapter 52. Monsieur de Gesvres's round. D'Artagnan was little used to resistance like that he had just experienced. He returned, profoundly irritated, to Nantes. Irritation, with this vigorous man, usually vented itself in impetuous attack, which few people hitherto, were they king, were they giants, had been able to resist. Trembling with rage, he went straight to the castle, and asked an audience with the king. It might be about 7 o'clock in the morning, and, since his arrival at Nantes, the king had been an early riser. But on arriving at the corridor with which we are acquainted, D'Artagnan found M. de Gesvres, who stopped him politely, telling him not to speak too loud and disturb the king. "Is the king asleep?" said D'Artagnan. "Well, I will let him sleep. But about what o'clock do you suppose he will rise?" "Oh, in about 2 hours. His majesty has been up all night." D'Artagnan took his hat again, bowed to M. de Gesvres, and returned to his own apartments. He came back at 9:30, and was told that the king was at breakfast. "That will just suit me," said D'Artagnan. "I will talk to the king while he is eating." M. de Brienne reminded D'Artagnan that the king would not see any one at mealtime. "But," said D'Artagnan, looking askant at Brienne, "you do not know, perhaps, monsieur, that I have the privilege of entree anywhere, and at any hour." Brienne took the captain's hand kindly, and said, "Not at Nantes, dear Monsieur d'Artagnan. The king, in this journey, has changed everything." D'Artagnan, a little softened, asked about what o'clock the king would have finished his breakfast. "We don't know." "Eh? Don't know? What does that mean? You don't know how much time the king devotes to eating? It is generally an hour, and if we admit that the air of the Loire gives an additional appetite, we will extend it to an hour and a half. That is enough, I think. I will wait where I am." "Oh, dear Monsieur d'Artagnan, the order of the day is not to allow any person to remain in this corridor. I am on guard for that particular purpose." D'Artagnan felt his anger mounting to his brain a second time. He went out quickly, for fear of complicating the affair by a display of premature ill humor. As soon as he was out, he began to reflect. "The king," said he, "will not receive me, that is evident. The young man is angry. He is afraid, beforehand, of the words that I may speak to him. Yes, but in the meantime Belle Isle is besieged, and my two friends by now probably taken or killed. Poor Porthos! As to Master Aramis, he is always full of resources, and I am easy on his account. But no, no, Porthos is not yet an invalid, nor is Aramis in his dotage. The one with his arm, the other with his imagination, will find work for his majesty's soldiers. Who knows if these brave men may not get up for the edification of his most Christian majesty a bastion of Saint Gervais? I don't despair of it. They have cannon and a garrison. And yet," continued D'Artagnan, "I don't know whether it would not be better to stop the combat. For myself alone, I would not put up with either surly looks or insults from the king, but for my friends I must put up with everything. Shall I go to M. Colbert? Now, there is a man I must acquire the habit of terrifying. I will go to M. Colbert." And D'Artagnan set forth bravely to find M. Colbert, but was informed that he was working with the king at the castle of Nantes. "Good!" cried he. "The times have come again in which I measured my steps from de Treville to the cardinal, from the cardinal to the queen, from the queen to Louis XIII. Truly is it said that men, in growing old, become children again. To the castle, then!" He returned thither. M. de Lyonne was coming out. He gave D'Artagnan both hands, but told him that the king had been busy all the preceding evening and all night, and that orders had been given that no one should be admitted. "Not even the captain who takes the order?" cried D'Artagnan. "I think that is rather too strong." "Not even he," said M. de Lyonne. "Since that is the case," replied D'Artagnan, wounded to the heart, "since the captain of the musketeers, who has always entered the king's chamber, is no longer allowed to enter it, his cabinet, or his salle à manger, either the king is dead, or his captain is in disgrace. Do me a favor, then, M. de Lyonne, who are in favor, to return and tell the king plainly I send him my resignation." "D'Artagnan, beware of what you are doing." "For friendship's sake, go." And he pushed him gently towards the cabinet. "Well, I will go," said Lyonne. D'Artagnan waited, walking about the corridor in no enviable mood. Lyonne returned. "Well, what did the king say?" exclaimed D'Artagnan. "He simply answered, ''Tis well,'" replied Lyonne. "That it was well!" said the captain, with an explosion. "That is to say, that he accepts it? Good! Now, then, I am free. I am only a plain citizen, Monsieur de Lyonne. I have the pleasure of bidding you good bye. Farewell, castle, corridor, antechamber. A bourgeois, about to breathe at liberty, takes his farewell of you." And without waiting longer, the captain sprang from the terrace down the staircase where he had picked up the fragments of Gourville's letter. 5 minutes after, he was at the hostelry, where, according to the custom of all great officers who have lodgings at the castle, he had taken what was called his city chamber. But when he arrived there, instead of throwing off his sword and cloak, he took his pistols, put his money into a large leather purse, sent for his horses from the castle stables, and gave orders that would ensure their reaching Vannes during the night. Everything went on according to his wishes. At 8 o'clock in the evening, he was putting his foot in the stirrup, when M. de Gesvres appeared, at the head of 12 guards, in front of the hostelry. D'Artagnan saw all from the corner of his eye. He could not fail seeing 13 men and 13 horses. But he feigned not to observe anything, and was about to put his horse in motion. Gesvres rode up to him. "Monsieur d'Artagnan," said he aloud. "Ah, Monsieur de Gesvres, good evening." "One would say you were getting on horseback." "More than that, I am mounted, as you see." "It is fortunate I have met with you." "Were you looking for me, then?" "Mon Dieu, yes." "On the part of the king, I will wager?" "Yes." "As I 3 days ago went in search of Monsieur Fouquet." "Oh! Nonsense. It is no use being over delicate with me; that is all labor lost. Tell me at once you are come to arrest me." "To arrest you? Good heavens, no." "Why do you come to accost me with 12 horsemen at your heels, then?" "I am making my round." "That isn't bad. And so you pick me up in your round, eh?" "I don't pick you up. I meet with you, and I beg you to come with me." "Where?" "To the king." "Good," said D'Artagnan, with a bantering air. "The king is disengaged." "For heaven's sake, captain," said M. de Gesvres, in a low voice to the musketeer, "do not compromise yourself; these men hear you." D'Artagnan laughed aloud, and replied, "March! People who are arrested are placed between the 6 first guards and the 6 last." "But as I am not arresting you," said M. de Gesvres, "you will march behind, with me, if you please." "Well," said D'Artagnan, "that is very polite, duke, and you are right in being so; for if ever I had had to make my rounds near your chambre de ville, I should have been courteous to you, I assure you, on the word of a gentleman. Now, one favor more. What does the king want with me?" "Oh, the king is furious." "Very well. The king, who has thought it worth while to be angry, may take the trouble to grow calm again, that is all. I shan't die of that, I will swear." "No, but " "But I shall be sent to keep company with unfortunate M. Fouquet. Mordioux! That is a gallant man, a worthy man. We shall live very sociably together, I will be sworn." "Here we are at the place of destination," said the duke. "Captain, for heaven's sake, be calm with the king." "Ah! You are playing the brave man with me, duke," said D'Artagnan, throwing one of his defiant glances over Gesvres. "I have been told that you are ambitious of uniting your guards with my musketeers. This strikes me as a splendid opportunity." "I will take exceeding good care not to avail myself of it, captain." "And why not, pray?" "Oh, for many reasons. In the first place, for this: if I were to succeed you in the musketeers after having arrested you—" "Ah! then you admit you have arrested me." "No, I don't." "Say met me, then. So you were saying if you were to succeed me after having arrested me—" "Your musketeers, at the first exercise with ball cartridges, would fire my way by mistake." "Oh! As to that I won't say, for the fellows do love me a little." Gesvres made D'Artagnan pass in first, and took him straight to the cabinet where Louis was waiting for his captain of the musketeers, and placed himself behind his colleague in the antechamber. The king could be heard distinctly, speaking aloud to Colbert, in the same cabinet where Colbert might have heard, a few days before, the king speaking aloud with M. d'Artagnan. The guards remained as a mounted picket before the principal gate, and the report was quickly spread throughout the city that Monsieur le Capitaine of the musketeers had been arrested by order of the king. Then these men were seen to be in motion, and as in the good old days of Louis XIII. And M. de Treville, groups were formed and staircases were filled. Vague murmurs, issuing from the court below, came rolling to the upper stories, like the distant moaning of the waves. M. de Gesvres became uneasy. He looked at his guards, who, after being interrogated by the musketeers who had just got among their ranks, began to shun them with a manifestation of innocence. D'Artagnan was certainly less disturbed by all this than M. de Gesvres, the captain of the guards. As soon as he entered, he seated himself on the ledge of a window, whence with his eagle glance he saw all that was going on without the least emotion. No step of the progressive fermentation which had shown itself at the report of his arrest escaped him. He foresaw the very moment the explosion would take place, and we know that his previsions were in general correct. It would be very whimsical, thought he, if this evening my praetorians should make me king of France. How I should laugh! But at the height all was stopped. Guards, musketeers, officers, soldiers, murmurs, uneasiness, dispersed, vanished, died away. There was an end of menace and sedition. One word had calmed the waves. The king had desired Brienne to say, "Hush, messieurs, you disturb the king." D'Artagnan sighed. "All is over," said he. "The musketeers of the present day are not those of his majesty Louis XIII. All is over." "Monsieur d'Artagnan, you are wanted in the antechamber of the king," proclaimed an usher. Chapter 53. King Louis XIV. The king was seated in his cabinet, with his back turned towards the door of entrance. In front of him was a mirror, in which, while turning over his papers, he could see at a glance those who came in. He did not take any notice of the entrance of D'Artagnan, but spread above his letters and plans the large silk cloth he used to conceal his secrets from the importunate. D'Artagnan understood this by-play, and kept in the background, so that at the end of a minute the king, who heard nothing, and saw nothing save from the corner of his eye, was obliged to cry, "Is not Monsieur d'Artagnan there?" "I am here, sire," replied the musketeer, advancing. "Well, monsieur," said the king, fixing his pellucid eyes on D'Artagnan, "what have you to say to me?" "I, sire," replied the latter, who watched the first blow of his adversary to make a good retort, "I have nothing to say to your majesty, unless it be that you have caused me to be arrested, and here I am." The king was going to reply that he had not had D'Artagnan arrested, but any such sentence appeared too much like an excuse, and he was silent. D'Artagnan likewise preserved an obstinate silence. "Monsieur," at length resumed the king, "what did I charge you to go and do at Belle Isle? Tell me, if you please." The king, while uttering these words, looked intently at his captain. Here D'Artagnan was fortunate. The king seemed to place the game in his hands. "I believe," replied he, "that your majesty does me the honor to ask what I went to Belle Isle to accomplish?" "Yes, monsieur." "Well, sire, I know nothing about it. It is not of me that question should be asked, but of that infinite number of officers of all kinds, to whom have been given innumerable orders of all kinds, whilst to me, head of the expedition, nothing precise was said or stated in any form whatever." The king was hurt. He showed it by his reply.
Monsieur," said he, "orders have only been given to such as were judged faithful."
"And therefore I have been astonished, sire," retorted the musketeer, "that a captain like myself, who ranks with a marechal of France, should have found himself under the orders of 5 or 6 lieutenants or majors, good to make spies of, possibly, but not at all fit to conduct a warlike expedition. It was upon this subject I came to demand an explanation of your majesty, when I found the door closed against me, which the final insult offered to a brave man has led me to quit your majesty's service."
"Monsieur," replied the king, "you still believe that you are living in an age when kings were, as you complain of having been, under the orders and at the discretion of their inferiors. You seem to forget that a king owes an account of his actions to none but God."
"I forget nothing, sire," said the musketeer, wounded by this lesson. "Besides, I do not see in what an honest man, when he asks of his king how he has ill served him, offends him."
"You have ill served me, monsieur, by siding with my enemies against me."
"Who are your enemies, sire?"
"The men I sent you to fight."
2 men the enemies of the whole of your majesty's army. That is incredible."
"You have no power to judge of my will."
"But I have to judge of my own friendships, sire."
"He who serves his friends does not serve his master."
"I so well understand this, sire, that I have respectfully offered your majesty my resignation."
"And I have accepted it, monsieur," said the king. "Before being separated from you, I was willing to prove to you that I know how to keep my word."
"Your majesty has kept more than your word, for your majesty has had me arrested," said D'Artagnan, with his cold, bantering air. "You did not promise me that, sire." The king would not condescend to perceive the pleasantry, and continued, seriously,
"You see, monsieur, to what grave steps your disobedience forces me."
"My disobedience!" cried D'Artagnan, red with anger.
"It is the mildest term that I can find," pursued the king. "My idea was to take and punish rebels. Was I bound to inquire whether these rebels were your friends or not?"
"But I was," replied D'Artagnan. "It was a cruelty on your majesty's part to send me to capture my friends and lead them to your gibbets."
"It was a trial I had to make, monsieur, of pretended servants, who eat my bread and should defend my person. The trial has succeeded ill, Monsieur d'Artagnan."
"For one bad servant your majesty loses," said the musketeer, with bitterness, "there are 10 who on that same day go through a like ordeal. Listen to me, sire. I am not accustomed to that service. Mine is a rebel sword when I am required to do ill. It was ill to send me in pursuit of 2 men whose lives Monsieur Fouquet, your majesty's preserver, implored you to save. Still further, these men were my friends. They did not attack your majesty, they succumbed to your blind anger. Besides, why were they not allowed to escape? What crime had they committed? I admit you may contest with me the right of judging their conduct, but why suspect me before the action? Why surround me with spies? Why disgrace me before the army? Why me, in whom till now you have showed the most entire confidence, who for 30 years has been attached to your person, and have given you 1,000 proofs of my devotion? For it must be said, now that I am accused, why reduce me to see 3,000 of the king's soldiers march in battle against 2 men?"
"One would say you have forgotten what these men have done to me," said the king in a hollow voice, "and that it was no merit of theirs I was not lost."
"Sire, one would imagine you forget that I was there."
"Enough, Monsieur d'Artagnan, enough of these dominating interests which arise to keep the sun itself from my interests. I am founding a state in which there shall be but one master, as I promised you. The moment is at hand for me to keep my promise. You wish to be, according to your tastes or private friendships, free to destroy my plans and save my enemies? I will thwart you, or will drop you. Seek a more compliant master. I know full well that another king would not conduct himself as I do, and would allow himself to be dominated by you, at the risk of sending you some day to keep company with M. Fouquet and the rest. But I have an excellent memory, and for me, services are sacred titles to gratitude, to impunity. You shall only have this lesson, Monsieur d'Artagnan, as the punishment of your want of discipline, and I will not imitate my predecessors in anger, not having imitated them in favor. And then, other reasons make me act mildly toward you. In the first place, because you are a man of sense, a man of excellent sense, a man of heart, and that you will be a capital servant to him who shall have mastered you. Secondly, because you will cease to have any motives for insubordination. Your friends are now destroyed or ruined by me. These supports on which your capricious mind instinctively relied, I have caused to disappear. At this moment my soldiers have taken or killed the rebels of Belle Isle. D'Artagnan became pale. "Taken or killed!" cried he. "Oh, sire, if you thought what you tell, if you were sure you were telling me the truth, I should forget all that is just, all that is magnanimous in your words, to call you a barbarous king and an unnatural man. But I pardon you these words," said he, smiling with pride. "I pardon them to a young prince who does not know, who cannot comprehend what such men as M. d'Herblay, M. du Vallon, and myself are. Taken or killed. Ah, sire! Tell me, if the news is true, how much has it cost you in men and money? We will then reckon if the game has been worth the stakes." As he spoke thus, the king went up to him in great anger, and said, "Monsieur d'Artagnan, your replies are those of a rebel. Tell me, if you please, who is king of France? Do you know any other?" "Sire," replied the captain of the musketeers, coldly, "I very well remember that one morning at Vaux you addressed that question to many people who did not answer to it, whilst I, on my part, did answer to it. If I recognized my king on that day, when the thing was not easy, I think it would be useless to ask the question of me now, when your majesty and I are alone." At these words Louis cast down his eyes. It appeared to him that the shade of the unfortunate Philippe passed between D'Artagnan and himself, to evoke the remembrance of that terrible adventure. Almost at the same moment an officer entered and placed a dispatch in the hands of the king, who, in his turn, changed color while reading it. "Monsieur," said he, "what I learn here you would know later. It is better I should tell you, and that you should learn it from the mouth of your king. A battle has taken place at Belle Isle." "Is it possible?" said D'Artagnan, with a calm air, though his heart was beating fast enough to choke him. "Well, sire?" "Well, monsieur, and I have lost 110 men." A beam of joy and pride shone in the eyes of D'Artagnan. "And the rebels?" said he. "The rebels have fled," said the king. D'Artagnan could not restrain a cry of triumph. "Only," added the king, "I have a fleet which closely blockades Belle Isle, and I am certain not a bark can escape." "So that," said the musketeer, brought back to his dismal idea, "if these two gentlemen are taken " "They will be hanged," said the king, quietly. "And do they know it?" replied D'Artagnan, repressing his trembling. "They know it, because you must have told them yourself, and all the country knows it." "Then, sire, they will never be taken alive. I will answer for that." "Ah!" said the king, negligently, and taking up his letter again. "Very well, they will be dead then, Monsieur d'Artagnan, and that will come to the same thing, since I should only take them to have them hanged." D'Artagnan wiped the sweat which flowed from his brow. "I have told you," pursued Louis XIV., "that I would one day be an affectionate, generous, and constant master. You are now the only man of former times worthy of my anger or my friendship. I will not spare you either sentiment, according to your conduct. Could you serve a king, Monsieur d'Artagnan, who should have 100 kings, his equals, in the kingdom? Could I, tell me, do with such weak instruments the great things I meditate? Did you ever see an artist effect great works with an unworthy tool? Far from us, monsieur, the old leaven of feudal abuse, the Fronde, which threatened to ruin monarchy, has emancipated it. I am master at home, Captain d'Artagnan, and I shall have servants who, lacking perhaps your genius, will carry devotion and obedience to the verge of heroism. Of what consequence, I ask you, of what consequence is it that God has given no sense to arms and legs? It is to the head he has given genius, and the head, you know, the rest obey. I am the head. D'Artagnan started. Louis XIV continued as if he had seen nothing, although this emotion had not by any means escaped him. Now let us conclude between us two the bargain I promised to make with you one day when you found me in a very strange predicament at Blois. Do me justice, monsieur, when you admit I do not make any one pay for the tears of shame that I then shed. Look around you. Lofty heads have bowed. Bow yours, or choose such exile as will suit you. Perhaps, when reflecting upon it, you will find your king has a generous heart, who reckons sufficiently upon your loyalty to allow you to leave him dissatisfied when you possess a great state secret. You are a brave man, I know you to be so. Why have you judged me prematurely? Judge me from this day forward, D'Artagnan, and be as severe as you please. D'Artagnan remained bewildered, mute, undecided for the first time in his life. At last he had found an adversary worthy of him. This was no longer trick, it was calculation. No longer violence, but strength. No longer passion, but will. No longer boasting, but counsel. This young man who had brought down a Fouquet, and could do without a D'Artagnan, deranged the somewhat headstrong calculations of the musketeer. "Come, let us see what stops you," said the king, kindly. "You have given in your resignation. Shall I refuse to accept it? I admit that it may be hard for such an old captain to recover lost good humor." "Oh," replied D'Artagnan, in a melancholy tone, "that is not my most serious care. I hesitate to take back my resignation, because I am old in comparison with you, and have habits difficult to abandon. Henceforward you must have courtiers who know how to amuse you, madmen who will get themselves killed to carry out what you call your great works. Great they will be, I feel. But if by chance I should not think them so? I have seen war, sire. I have seen peace. I have served Richelieu and Mazarin. I have been scorched with your father at the fire of Rochelle, riddled with sword thrusts like a sieve, having grown a new skin 10 times, as serpents do. After affronts and injustices, I have a command which was formerly something, because it gave the bearer the right of speaking as he liked to his king. But your captain of the musketeers will henceforward be an officer guarding the outer doors. Truly, sire, if that is to be my employment from this time, seize the opportunity of our being on good terms to take it from me. Do not imagine that I bear malice. No, you have tamed me, as you say, but it must be confessed that in taming me you have lowered me. By bowing me you have convicted me of weakness. If you knew how well it suits me to carry my head high, and what a pitiful mien I should have while scenting the dust of your carpets. Oh, sire, I regret sincerely, and you will regret as I do, the old days when the king of France saw in every vestibule those insolent gentlemen, lean, always swearing, cross-grained mastiffs, who could bite mortally in the hour of danger or of battle. These men were the best of courtiers to the hand which fed them; they would lick it.
But for the hand that struck them, oh, the bite that followed! A little gold on the lace of their cloaks, a slender stomach in their haute de chausse, a little sparkling of gray in their dry hair, and you will behold the handsome dukes and peers, the haughty marechaux of France. But why should I tell you all this? The king is master. He wills that I should make verses. He wills that I should polish the mosaics of his antechambers with satin shoes. Mordioux! That is difficult, but I have got over greater difficulties. I will do it. Why should I do it? Because I love money? I have enough. Because I am ambitious? My career is almost at an end. Because I love the court? No. I will remain here because I have been accustomed for 30 years to go and take the orderly word of the king, and to have said to me, "Good evening, D'Artagnan," with a smile I did not beg for. That smile I will beg for. Are you content, sire? And D'Artagnan bowed his silver head, upon which the smiling king placed his white hand with pride. "Thanks, my old servant, my faithful friend," said he. "As, reckoning from this day, I have no longer any enemies in France, it remains with me to send you to a foreign field to gather your marshal's baton. Depend upon me for finding you an opportunity. In the meanwhile, eat of my very best bread, and sleep in absolute tranquillity." "That is all kind and well," said D'Artagnan, much agitated, "but those poor men at Belle Isle, one of them in particular, so good, so brave, so true." "Do you ask their pardon of me?" "Upon my knees, sire." "Well, then go and take it to them, if it be still in time. But do you answer for them?" "With my life, sire." "Go, then. Tomorrow I set out for Paris. Return by that time, for I do not wish you to leave me in the future." "Be assured of that, sire," said D'Artagnan, kissing the royal hand. And with a heart swelling with joy, he rushed out of the castle on his way to Belle Isle. Chapter 54. Monsieur Fouquet's Friends. The king had returned to Paris, and with him D'Artagnan, who, in 24 hours, having made with greatest care all possible inquiries at Belle Isle, succeeded in learning nothing of the secret so well kept by the heavy rock of Locmaria, which had fallen on the heroic Porthos. The captain of the musketeers only knew what those two valiant men, these two friends, whose defense he had so nobly taken up, whose lives he had so earnestly endeavored to save, aided by 3 faithful Bretons, had accomplished against a whole army. He had seen, spread on the neighboring heath, the human remains which had stained with clouted blood the scattered stones among the flowering broom. He learned also that a bark had been seen far out at sea, and that, like a bird of prey, a royal vessel had pursued, overtaken, and devoured the poor little bird that was flying with such palpitating wings. But there D'Artagnan's certainties ended. The field of supposition was thrown open. Now what could he conjecture? The vessel had not returned. It is true that a brisk wind had prevailed for 3 days, but the corvette was known to be a good sailor, and solid in its timbers. It had no need to fear a gale of wind, and it ought, according to the calculation of D'Artagnan, to have either returned to Brest, or come back to the mouth of the Loire. Such was the news, ambiguous, it is true, but in some degree reassuring to him personally, which D'Artagnan brought to Louis XIV, when the king, followed by all the court, returned to Paris. Louis, satisfied with his success, Louis, more mild and affable as he felt himself more powerful, had not ceased for an instant to ride beside the carriage door of Mademoiselle de la Valliere. Everybody was anxious to amuse the two queens, so as to make them forget this abandonment by son and husband. Everything breathed the future, the past was nothing to anybody. Only that past was like a painful bleeding wound to the hearts of certain tender and devoted spirits. Scarcely was the king reinstalled in Paris when he received a touching proof of this. Louis XIV. Had just risen and taken his first repast, when his captain of the musketeers presented himself before him. D'Artagnan was pale and looked unhappy. The king, at the first glance, perceived the change in a countenance generally so unconcerned. "What is the matter, D'Artagnan?" said he. "Sire, a great misfortune has happened to me." "Good heavens! What is that?" "Sire, I have lost one of my friends, Monsieur du Vallon, in the affair of Belle Isle." And while speaking these words, D'Artagnan fixed his falcon eye upon Louis XIV. To catch the first feeling that would show itself. "I knew it," replied the king, quietly. "You knew it, and did not tell me?" cried the musketeer. "To what good? Your grief, my friend, was so well worthy of respect. It was my duty to treat it gently. To have informed you of this misfortune, which I knew would pain you greatly, D'Artagnan, would have been, in your eyes, to have triumphed over you. Yes, I knew that Monsieur du Vallon had buried himself beneath the rocks of Locmaria. I knew that Monsieur d'Herblay had taken one of my vessels with its crew, and had compelled it to convey him to Bayonne. But I was willing you should learn these matters in a direct manner, in order that you might be convinced my friends are with me respected and sacred, that always in me the man will sacrifice himself to subjects, whilst the king is so often found to sacrifice men to majesty and power. But, sire, how could you know?" "How do you yourself know, D'Artagnan?" "By this letter, sire, which Monsieur d'Herblay, free and out of danger, writes me from Bayonne." "Look here," said the king, drawing from a casket placed upon the table close to the seat upon which D'Artagnan was leaning. "Here is a letter copied exactly from that of Monsieur d'Herblay. Here is the very letter, which Colbert placed in my hands a week before you received yours. I am well served, you may perceive." "Yes, sire," murmured the musketeer, "you were the only man whose star was equal to the task of dominating the fortune and strength of my two friends. You have used your power, sire. You will not abuse it, will you?" "D'Artagnan," said the king, with a smile beaming with kindness, "I could have Monsieur d'Herblay carried off from the territories of the king of Spain, and brought here alive, to inflict justice upon him. But, D'Artagnan, be assured I will not yield to this first and natural impulse. He is free. Let him continue free." "Oh, sire, you will not always remain so clement, so noble, so generous as you have shown yourself with respect to me and Monsieur d'Herblay. You will have about you counselors who will cure you of that weakness." "No, D'Artagnan, you are mistaken when you accuse my council of urging me to pursue rigorous measures. The advice to spare Monsieur d'Herblay comes from Colbert himself." "Oh, sire!" said D'Artagnan, extremely surprised. "As for you," continued the king, with a kindness very uncommon to him, "I have several pieces of good news to announce to you, but you shall know them, my dear captain, the moment I have made my accounts all straight. I have said that I wish to make, and would make, your fortune. That promise will soon become reality." "A thousand times thanks, sire. I can wait. But I implore you, whilst I go and practice patience, that your majesty will deign to notice those poor people who have for so long a time besieged your antechamber, and come humbly to lay a petition at your feet." "Who are they?" "Enemies of your majesty." The king raised his head. "Friends of M. Fouquet," added D'Artagnan. "Their names?" "M. Gourville, M. Pelisson, and a poet, M. Jean de La Fontaine." The king took a moment to reflect. "What do they want?" "I do not know." "How do they appear?" "In great affliction." "What do they say?" "Nothing."
What do they do?"
"They weep."
"Let them come in," said the king, with a serious brow.
D'Artagnan turned rapidly on his heel, raised the tapestry which closed the entrance to the royal chamber, and directing his voice to the adjoining room, cried, "Enter!" The three men D'Artagnan had named immediately appeared at the door of the cabinet in which were the king and his captain. A profound silence prevailed in their passage. The courtiers, at the approach of the friends of the unfortunate superintendent of finances, drew back, as if fearful of being affected by contagion with disgrace and misfortune. D'Artagnan, with a quick step, came forward to take by the hand the unhappy men who stood trembling at the door of the cabinet. He led them in front of the king's fauteuil, who, having placed himself in the embrasure of a window, awaited the moment of presentation, and was preparing himself to give the supplicants a rigorously diplomatic reception. The first of the friends of Fouquet's to advance was Pelisson. He did not weep, but his tears were only restrained that the king might better hear his voice and prayer. Gourville bit his lips to check his tears, out of respect for the king. La Fontaine buried his face in his handkerchief, and the only signs of life he gave were the convulsive motions of his shoulders, raised by his sobs. The king preserved his dignity. His countenance was impassible. He even maintained the frown which appeared when D'Artagnan announced his enemies. He made a gesture which signified "Speak," and he remained standing, with his eyes fixed searchingly on these desponding men. Pelisson bowed to the ground, and La Fontaine knelt as people do in churches. This dismal silence, disturbed only by sighs and groans, began to excite in the king, not compassion, but impatience. "Monsieur Pelisson," said he, in a sharp, dry tone, "Monsieur Gourville, and you, monsieur," and he did not name La Fontaine, "I cannot, without sensible displeasure, see you come to plead for one of the greatest criminals it is the duty of justice to punish. A king does not allow himself to soften save at the tears of the innocent, the remorse of the guilty. I have no faith either in the remorse of M. Fouquet or the tears of his friends, because the one is tainted to the very heart, and the others ought to dread offending me in my own palace. For these reasons, I beg you, Monsieur Pelisson, Monsieur Gourville, and you, monsieur, to say nothing that will not plainly proclaim the respect you have for my will." "Sire," replied Pelisson, trembling at these words, "we are come to say nothing to your majesty that is not the most profound expression of the most sincere respect and love that are due to a king from all his subjects. Your majesty's justice is redoubtable. Every one must yield to the sentences it pronounces. We respectfully bow before it. Far from us the idea of coming to defend him who has had the misfortune to offend your majesty. He who has incurred your displeasure may be a friend of ours, but he is an enemy to the state. We abandon him, but with tears, to the severity of the king." "Besides," interrupted the king, calmed by that supplicating voice and those persuasive words, "my parliament will decide. I do not strike without first having weighed the crime. My justice does not wield the sword without employing first a pair of scales." "Therefore we have every confidence in that impartiality of the king, and hope to make our feeble voices heard, with the consent of your majesty, when the hour for defending an accused friend strikes." "In that case, messieurs, what do you ask of me?" said the king, with his most imposing air. "Sire," continued Pelisson, "the accused has a wife and family. The little property he had was scarcely sufficient to pay his debts, and Madame Fouquet, since her husband's captivity, is abandoned by everybody. The hand of your majesty strikes like the hand of God. When the Lord sends the curse of leprosy or pestilence into a family, every one flies and shuns the abode of the leprous or plague stricken. Sometimes, but very rarely, a generous physician alone ventures to approach the ill reputed threshold, passes it with courage, and risks his life to combat death. He is the last resource of the dying, the chosen instrument of heavenly mercy. Sire, we supplicate you, with clasped hands and bended knees, as a divinity is supplicated. Madame Fouquet has no longer any friends, no longer any means of support. She weeps in her deserted home, abandoned by all those who besieged its doors in the hour of prosperity. She has neither credit nor hope left. At least, the unhappy wretch upon whom your anger falls receives from you, however culpable he may be, his daily bread, though moistened by his tears. As much afflicted, more destitute than her husband, Madame Fouquet, the lady who had the honor to receive your majesty at her table, Madame Fouquet, the wife of the ancient superintendent of your majesty's finances, Madame Fouquet has no longer bread." Here the mortal silence which had chained the breath of Pelisson's two friends was broken by an outburst of sobs, and D'Artagnan, whose chest heaved at hearing this humble prayer, turned round towards the angle of the cabinet to bite his mustache and conceal a groan. The king had preserved his eye dry and his countenance severe, but the blood had mounted to his cheeks, and the firmness of his look was visibly diminished. "What do you wish?" said he, in an agitated voice. "We come humbly to ask your majesty," replied Pelisson, upon whom emotion was fast gaining, "to permit us, without incurring the displeasure of your majesty, to lend to Madame Fouquet 2,000 pistoles collected among the old friends of her husband, in order that the widow may not stand in need of the necessaries of life." At the word widow, pronounced by Pelisson whilst Fouquet was still alive, the king turned very pale. His pride disappeared, pity rose from his heart to his lips, he cast a softened look upon the men who knelt sobbing at his feet. "God forbid," said he, "that I should confound the innocent with the guilty. They know me but ill who doubt my mercy towards the weak. I strike none but the arrogant. Do, messieurs, do all that your hearts counsel you to assuage the grief of Madame Fouquet. Go, messieurs, go." The three now rose in silence with dry eyes. The tears had been scorched away by contact with their burning cheeks and eyelids. They had not the strength to address their thanks to the king, who himself cut short their solemn reverences by entrenching himself suddenly behind the fauteuil. D'Artagnan remained alone with the king. "Well," said he, approaching the young prince, who interrogated him with his look, "well, my master, if you had not the device which belongs to your son, I would recommend you one which M. Conrart might translate into eclectic Latin: calm with the lowly, stormy with the strong." The king smiled, and passed into the next apartment, after having said to D'Artagnan, "I give you the leave of absence you must want to put the affairs of your friend, the late M. du Vallon, in order.